My name doesn't matter as much as the story does, so let me start there, with a memory that has followed me for most of my life. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that something inside me didn't match the outside. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning strike, no mirror shattering, no cinematic revelation. It was quieter than that. It was a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, and my mother had laid out a dress on her bed for a wedding she was attending that evening. The dress was a muted silver, the color of rain on pavement, and it had a small ribbon at the waist. I remember standing in the doorway of her room, holding a plastic dinosaur in one hand, and feeling something in my chest that I did not have the vocabulary to name. It wasn't want, exactly. It wasn't envy. It was recognition. As if the dress had been waiting for someone, and that someone might have been me. I turned away from the door before my mother saw me looking, and I went back to my room, and I lined up my dinosaurs on the windowsill the way I always did, and I told myself I had imagined it. That was the first lie I ever told myself. It would not be the last. I want to be careful as I tell this story, not to make it sound like a fairy tale, because it was a one. It was a life, with all the ordinary things a life contains. Homework, arguments at the dinner table, scraped knees, first jobs, small betrayals, small kindnesses, and the long, slow work of trying to figure out who you are while the world insists on telling you who you should be. I am telling this story because I have finally reached a place where I can tell it without shame, and because I know there are people listening who are still standing in the doorway of a room, looking at a silver dress, and telling themselves they imagined it. I want them to know they didn't. My childhood was, by most measures, a good one. My parents were kind people who loved me in the language they knew, which was the language of steady meals and clean laundry and being present at parent-teacher conferences even when they were exhausted from work. My father was a mechanic, a man with permanently stained fingernails and an unshakable belief in the dignity of manual labor. My mother worked at a pharmacy and had a laugh that could fill a room. I had a younger sister, 3 years behind me, whose bedroom was directly across the hall from mine, and whose closet, I would later realize, was both a source of enormous temptation and enormous terror. We lived in a small town in the middle of a country that prided itself on its ordinariness. There were 2 churches, 1 grocery store, a high school football team that people cared about far more than they should have, and a code of masculinity as strict and unspoken as scripture. Boys did not cry. Boys did not play with dolls. Boys did not linger too long in the girls' section of the department store. Boys were, above all, boys, and there was only one acceptable way to be one. I learned these rules the way children learn the temperature of a stove, by getting burned. When I was 9, I picked up a doll at a friend's house, a doll with long brown hair and a plastic tiara, and my friend's older brother laughed at me in a way that felt like being slapped. I put the doll down, and I did not pick up another one for almost 20 years. But the feeling did not go away. It never goes away, no matter how many times you put the doll down. What happened, instead, was that I learned to hide it. I became, without ever consciously deciding to, an expert in hiding. I hid in plain sight. I played the sports my father wanted me to play. I made friends with the boys who would protect me from being called the names I was afraid of being called. I laughed at the jokes I did not find funny. I built, over the course of my childhood, a version of myself that fit through the door the world had cut for me, and I did such a thorough job of it that for many years I forgot there had ever been another version underneath. Almost forgot. Not quite. The first time I actually did it, the first time I actually put on something that wasn't mine, I was 12 years old. My sister was at a sleepover. My parents were downstairs watching television. I had told them I was going to bed early because I had a headache, which was a lie, and I remember the specific texture of that lie, the way it sat in my mouth like a coin. I went into my sister's room, and I stood in front of her closet for what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds, and then I took out a dress. It was pale blue with small white flowers on it, and it was too small for me, and I put it on anyway. I looked in the mirror on the back of her door, and I did not recognize the person looking back, but I also, for the first time in my life, felt something that I would later understand was relief. It was as if I had been holding my breath for 12 years and had finally been allowed to exhale. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard my mother's footsteps on the stairs, and I tore the dress off so quickly I heard a small stitch pop somewhere along the seam, and I shoved it back into the closet in the wrong place, and I ran to my room and got into bed with my clothes still on, and I lay there in the dark listening to my heart hammer against my ribs, and I promised myself, with the fierce conviction only a 12-year-old can muster, that I would never, ever do that again. I did it again 3 weeks later. And then again. And then again. And each time I promised myself it would be the last time, and each time I broke the promise, and each time I hated myself a little more for the breaking. This is the part of the story that I think is hardest to explain to people who have never lived it. The shame. The way the shame becomes a room you live inside, with the walls slowly closing in. I did not have the words at 12 for what I was feeling. I did not know that other people, thousands of miles away, in cities I had never heard of, were feeling the same thing. This was before the internet was what it is now. There were no forums. There were no videos like this one. There was only me and my sister's closet, and the terrible certainty that I was the only person in the world who was broken in this specific way. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who is where I was then. You are not broken. You were not broken then, and you are not broken now. What you are is a person trying to understand yourself in a world that has not given you the tools to do so. That is not a personal failing. That is a circumstance. And circumstances, unlike character, can change. My teenage years were a long exercise in trying to outrun myself. I threw myself into the things that were expected of boys my age. I lifted weights. I got a job at the same auto shop where my father worked, and I learned to change oil and rotate tires and speak the shorthand language of men who work with their hands. I dated girls, and I liked some of them very much, and I want to be careful here too, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story dishonestly. I did care about the girls I dated. I was not using them as cover, not consciously. But I also could not tell them the truth about myself because I could not tell it to myself. And so every relationship I had in high school ended the same way, with a slow drift, a growing distance, a girl on the other end of a phone call saying she felt like she didn't really know me. She was right. She didn't. I didn't either. The dressing continued. It moved out of my sister's closet, because my sister was getting older and more observant, and into a duffel bag that I kept at the back of my own closet, behind a pile of old winter coats. I bought things when I could, a skirt from a thrift store 2 towns over, a pair of stockings that I paid for in cash, and shoved into my backpack before anyone could see. I did this maybe once a month at first, then twice a month. Then, by the time I was 16, whenever I could find an hour alone in the house, I would put on what I had, and I would sit on the edge of my bed, and I would look at myself in the mirror, and I would feel that same relief I had felt at 12, and then, when the hour was up, I would take it all off and put it back in the duffel bag, and hate myself for the rest of the day. It was not a healthy pattern. I understand that now. I want to say that clearly because I know young people sometimes listen to stories like this and take away the wrong lessons. Secrecy is not romance. Hiding is not adventure. The person I was at 16 was a person in real pain, and the pain was made worse by the isolation, and the isolation was made worse by the shame, and the shame was made worse by the certainty that if anyone ever found out, my life would end. Not literally, but the life I had built, the life my parents thought I was living, would be over. And I did not know what would grow in its place. I graduated high school. I went to a state university about 4 hours from home, and for the first time in my life, I had a room that was mine, a door that locked, a life that no one was watching. You would think this would have been liberating. In some ways it was. But in other ways it was worse, because now there was no one to hide from except myself, and I found that I was still very good at hiding. I dressed more often in college. I bought more things. I started, tentatively, to look at myself in the mirror for longer than a few seconds. I started to notice what looked right and what didn't, and to make small adjustments, and to feel, for the first time, something that was not just relief but something closer to curiosity. Who was this person in the mirror? What did she want? What would her life look like if she were allowed to have one? I did not have answers to any of these questions. I was still, in most of my waking hours, the person my parents and my roommates and my professors thought I was. I still played on an intramural soccer team. I still went to parties and drank cheap beer and made the kinds of jokes that were expected of me. But there was a second life running underneath the first one now, a quiet parallel existence, and the two of them were beginning to strain against each other in ways I did not know how to manage. The first person I ever told was a woman named Elena. We met in a poetry class our sophomore year. She was studying environmental science and taking the poetry class as an elective, and she wrote poems about rivers and erosion and the slow work of water on stone, and I fell in love with her before I knew her last name. We started dating in the spring. By the fall of our junior year, we were spending most nights in each other's apartments. I had never been closer to another human being. And I was terrified because I knew that I could not build a real life with her while carrying a secret this large, and I also knew that telling her might end everything. I remember the night I told her with a clarity I do not have for most of my life. It was a Tuesday in November. We had made pasta. There was a candle on the table because the overhead light in her kitchen had burned out and neither of us had gotten around to replacing it. I had been trying to work up the courage for weeks, and I had almost done it 3 or 4 times, and each time I had lost my nerve at the last second. That night, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I did not lose my nerve. I said, "There's something I need to tell you," and my voice sounded strange to me, thin and far away, as if it were coming from another room. And then I told her, not all of it. I did not have all the words yet. But I told her that sometimes I wore women's clothing, that I had been doing it since I was a child, that I did not know what it meant about me but that it was true, and that I could not keep it a secret from her anymore. She was quiet for a long time. I remember watching the candle flicker and thinking that this was the moment my life was going to end, that she was going to stand up and leave, that I would never see her again, that I had made the worst mistake I would ever make. And then she reached across the table and took my hand, and she said, "Okay." She said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "I don't fully understand it yet, but I want to." She said, "We can figure this out together. I want to be honest about what happened next because it would be dishonest to say that everything was fine after that. It wasn't." Elena and I struggled in the months that followed in ways that were hard for both of us. She had questions I could not answer. I had feelings I could not name. There were nights when she cried and nights when I cried and nights when we sat on opposite ends of her couch and didn't say anything at all. But she never left. And she never told anyone. And she gave me, without knowing she was giving it, the first experience I had ever had of being known by another person and not rejected. That experience changed my life. It did not solve anything. It did not answer any of the questions I still had about who I was or what I wanted. But it cracked something open. It made it possible for me to imagine, for the first time, that there might be a version of my life in which I did not have to hide. Elena and I broke up at the end of our senior year, for reasons that had very little to do with my dressing and very much to do with the ordinary heartbreaks of being 22 years old and standing at the edge of the rest of your life. We stayed friends. We still are, though we live in different cities now and go months without talking. I owe her a debt I will never be able to repay. My 20s were the hardest years of my life. I want to say that without embellishment. I moved to a city about 6 hours from where I grew up for a job in marketing that I was reasonably good at and did not particularly enjoy. I lived alone. I dressed almost every night in the privacy of my apartment, and the dressing had begun to feel less like a secret and more like a homecoming, but it was a homecoming to a house I could not invite anyone into. I did not tell my family. I did not tell my coworkers. I did not tell the people I dated, and I dated a lot in those years, in a way that was, I think now, an attempt to prove something to myself that could not be proven. I was unhappy in a way I did not know how to describe. I was not depressed in the clinical sense, or at least I did not think I was. I was functional. I paid my rent. I showed up to work. I called my mother every Sunday. But there was a low, constant hum of wrongness underneath everything, a sense that I was living someone else's life and had forgotten how to find my way back to my own. I started therapy when I was 26. This was, without exaggeration, the single most important decision I have ever made. I found a therapist through my insurance, A woman in her 50s named Dr. Marisol, who had a small office on the third floor of a building above a bakery, so that every session smelled faintly of bread. I did not tell her the truth for the first 4 months. I talked about my job and my family and my dating life and 100 other things, all of them real, none of them the real thing. She was patient. She did not push. She asked good questions and waited. And then one afternoon in March, with the smell of bread coming up through the floorboards and a cold rain hitting the window, I told her. Everything. The dinosaur on the windowsill. The silver dress on my mother's bed. The stitch that popped in my sister's blue dress. The duffel bag at the back of the closet. Elena and the candle and the pasta. The years of hiding. The exhaustion. She listened. When I was done, she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "It sounds like you have been carrying this alone for a very long time, and you don't have to anymore." I cried in her office for the first time that day, and I cried on the sidewalk outside afterward, and I cried on the bus home, and I cried in my apartment that night. Not because I was sad. Because something inside me that had been clenched for 2 decades was finally starting to unclench. The next few years were a slow, careful process of figuring out what any of this meant. I want to emphasize the word slow and careful because I know there is a temptation, in stories like this one, to skip from the moment of first honesty to the moment of full transformation, as if there is nothing in between. There is a great deal in between. There is a lot of confusion. There is a lot of doubt. There's a lot of asking yourself, over and over, whether what you are feeling is real, or whether you are making it up, or whether it will pass. It did not pass. I read books. I read the ones that had been recommended to me and the ones I found on my own, and I read them slowly and I underlined passages, and I sat with them for weeks before moving on to the next one. I found online communities, cautiously at first, and I lurked more than I posted, and I learned that there were many people who had felt what I had felt, and that they had found many different ways of living with it. Some of them dressed occasionally and lived otherwise as men, and were happy that way. Some of them dressed often and identified as women part-time, and were happy that way. Some of them, over months or years, came to understand that they wanted to live as women full-time, and they did, and they were happy that way. There was no single path. There was no correct answer. There was only the slow, honest work of figuring out which version of your life would let you breathe. I began to understand, slowly, that for me the answer was somewhere further along the path than I had originally imagined. It was not just that I wanted to dress. It was not just that I wanted to look like a woman for an hour at a time in the privacy of my apartment. It was that when I did those things, the person I saw in the mirror felt more like me than the person I saw in the mirror the rest of the time. That was a very difficult sentence to say out loud for the first time, even in the safety of Dr. Marisol's office. It took me almost a year of therapy to say it, and when I did, I said it while looking at the floor, and my voice was so quiet that she had to ask me to repeat it. I want to be clear about something here because I know this part of the story is where a lot of people get confused, or afraid, or angry. Coming to understand yourself as a woman when you have been raised as a man is not something that happens overnight, and it is not something you do lightly, and it is not something you do because it is trendy or exciting or because you have been influenced by the internet. It is something you do because the alternative, continuing to live in a body and a life that do not fit, has become unsustainable. It is the last door you try, not the first. And even then you try it slowly. You crack it open. You look inside. You close it again. You come back. Telling my family was the hardest thing I have ever done. I want to skip past this part because even now, years later, it is still tender to touch. But I promised myself, when I started telling the story, that I would tell it honestly, and honesty requires this. I told my sister first. She was living in another city by then, and I flew out to see her on a weekend in October, and I sat on her couch and I told her, and she cried, and then I cried, and then she got up and made us both tea, and when she came back, she sat down next to me and she said, "You are my sister, and I love you, and we will figure this out." She used the word sister, without hesitating. I will remember that until the day I die. My parents were harder. My mother took it, I think, better than I had feared and worse than I had hoped. There was a long silence on the phone when I told her, and then she said, "I need some time," and I said, "Of course you do," and we hung up. She called me back 3 days later. She had questions, some of them careful, some of them clumsy, all of them asked in good faith. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of the call, she said, "I don't understand all of this yet, but you are my child, and I will not lose you over something I don't understand." My father was hardest of all. My father, the mechanic, the man with the stained fingernails and the code of masculinity as strict as scripture. My father did not speak to me for 3 months after I told him. 3 months of unreturned calls, of silence at holidays, of my mother trying to broker peace in the middle. I want to tell you that at the end of those 3 months, he came around all at once, that he called me and apologized and told me he loved me, and that everything was fine after that. That is not what happened. What happened was that he called me one evening in February and he said, "I have been thinking." And then he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I do not understand this. I may never understand this. But I have been remembering you as a child, and I have been remembering how much I loved you then, and I love you the same amount now, and I do not want to be a father who cannot talk to his own child." And then he was quiet again, and I could hear him breathing, and I could hear in his breathing all the years of the code he had been raised inside, and all the effort it was taking him to step outside of it. Even a little, even for me. That was 6 years ago. My father and I still have hard conversations sometimes. He still, occasionally, uses the wrong words, and I still occasionally have to be patient in ways that are exhausting. But he calls me every Sunday now, the way I used to call my mother. He tells me about the cars he is working on. He asks me about my life. He is trying. That is more than I ever expected, and I am grateful for it every day. The transition itself, the medical part, was quieter than people expect. I do not want to dwell on the specifics because I do not think the specifics are what matter, and because I think there is a tendency in stories like this one to reduce a person's life to a checklist of procedures, as if the outside were the whole story. It is not. The outside is a small part of the story. The inside is the whole story. What I will say is that I made every decision slowly and in consultation with doctors and therapists I trusted, and with a clear understanding of what each step would mean for the rest of my life. I did not do anything impulsively. I do not regret anything I did. The changes, when they came, felt less like transformation and more like alignment, as if a picture that had been slightly out of focus for 30 years were finally being adjusted, one small turn of the lens at a time. There were hard days. There are still hard days. There are days when I am tired of being brave, tired of being an ambassador for my own existence, tired of the small, exhausting negotiations that come with being visibly different in a world that prefers sameness. There are days when I miss the version of myself that could walk through the world unnoticed, even though I know now that that version was not really me, that she was a costume I had learned to wear so well I had forgotten I was wearing it. But there are also days, many, many days now, when I catch a glimpse of myself in a window as I am walking past and I think, oh, there she is. There is the person who is standing in the doorway, looking at the silver dress. There is the 12-year-old who tore the blue dress off so fast she popped a stitch. There is the 22-year-old sitting across a candlelit table from a woman named Elena. There is the 26-year-old crying on a bus. There is all of them, and there is me, and we are the same person and we always were. I want to say something now about the people who are still where I was, and I want to say it directly, without ornament, because I know how it feels to listen to a story like this one and wonder whether any of it applies to you. If you are listening to this and you have felt something you cannot name and you have been carrying it alone, I want you to know a few things. I want you to know that you are not the only one. There have been people like us in every generation, in every country, in every century, going back as far as human history goes. You are part of a very long line of people who have quietly worked out how to be themselves in a world that did not always make it easy. You are not an aberration. You are not a symptom. You are a person. I want you to know that you do not have to know what any of this means about you right now. You can take your time. You can spend years figuring it out. You can change your mind 3 times before you settle on an answer, or you can never settle on an answer at all, and either of those things is okay. The point is not to arrive at a label. The point is to arrive at a life you can actually live. I want you to know that hiding will cost you more than you think it will. I hid for a long time, and I understand why people hide, and I do not judge anyone who is still hiding, because there are places in the world where hiding is a matter of survival, and I do not have the right to tell anyone else what to do with their own safety. But if it is possible for you to find one person, just one, a therapist, a friend, a stranger on a helpline, and tell them the truth, please try. The relief of being known, even by one person, is greater than I can describe. I want you to know that this is not about being special. I did not transition because I thought I was special. I did not do any of this to be interesting or to be seen or to be different for the sake of being different. I did it because I wanted to be ordinary in the deepest sense of the word, to walk through the world as myself, without a costume, without a performance, without a second life running underneath the first. Ordinariness, when you have been denied it for a long time, is the most precious thing there is. I want you to know that the people who love you may surprise you. Some of them will surprise you badly. Some of them will not be able to meet you where you are, and you will have to grieve the version of the relationship you thought you would have, and that grief is real, and you should not minimize it. But some of them, often the ones you were most afraid of, will surprise you well. My father, the mechanic, calling me every Sunday. My sister, using the word sister without hesitating. Elena, taking my hand across a table. These people saved my life, in ways they may never fully understand. Look for them. They exist. And I want you to know, finally, that this is not the end of my story, and it will not be the end of yours. There is a version of the transition narrative that ends at the transition, as if the medical procedures are the point, as if once you have arrived at the outside you have wanted, there is nothing left to talk about. That is not true. Life keeps happening. I still have a job I sometimes enjoy and sometimes find tedious. I still have bills I have to pay and dishes I have to wash and family arguments I have to navigate and small daily choices about how to spend my time and who to spend it with. I am still figuring out what I want out of my career, out of my friendships, out of the next 20 years. The transition made all of this possible, but it did not make it easy, because life is not easy for anyone, and pretending otherwise is a disservice to everyone who has ever tried to live one. What the transition gave me was not a happy ending. It was a beginning. It was the ability to stand at the door of my own life and know, for the first time, that it was mine. Everything I do inside that life, every friendship I build, every mistake I make, every kindness I offer, every small responsibility I take on, is now something I am doing as myself. That is not a small thing. That is, I think, the only thing. I want to say one more thing before I finish, because I have been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think it is important. This story is mine, but it is not the only story. There are people whose experience of gender is different from mine, and their stories are just as real and just as valid as this one. There are people who dress and do not transition, and who are happy. There are people who transition and later come to a different understanding of themselves, and their journeys are also legitimate. There are people whose lives look nothing like mine, and whose truths I could not possibly speak to. If you take one thing away from this story, I hope it is not a template. I hope it is a permission to sit with your own experience honestly, without forcing it to look like anyone else's, and to make the choices that let you live a life you can actually inhabit. There is a photograph I keep on the small shelf next to my bed. It is a picture of me at 7 years old, standing in front of my mother's dresser, holding a plastic dinosaur, wearing a t-shirt with a truck on it. I do not look like that child anymore, in any of the ways that a camera would notice. But when I look at that picture, I do not see a stranger. I see the person who is standing in the doorway looking at the silver dress. I see the person who has spent 30 years trying to find her way home. I see myself then and now, and I see that she is finally here. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.